Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy. Every teacher wants to know which programs are based in the science of reading research. These days, every product we see claims to be aligned to reading science. How do we know if it is or isn't? We know this can be really confusing and tricky. Our guest today will help us learn more about what to look for.
And our guest today is Holly Lane. We're so excited to talk with Holly today. She's the director of the University of Florida Literacy Institute and author of UFLI Foundations, which, if you don't know, I'm sure you do, but if you don't, it's an explicit and systematic phonics program that we'll probably talk about a bit today. So welcome, Holly.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks for
absolutely.
being here.
So we're going to just jump in with an easy question. Don't worry. Just kidding. It's really not. It's a really big question. But we want to talk about this term science of reading. Like Lori said, everything right now this is science. It's aligned to science of reading. Don't worry. But what does that term even mean? And do we even agree on what that term means across the board?
I don't think we do. I mean, I think that the people doing the science actually have a fairly decent understanding, and there's some consensus there. The interpretation of it from people outside of that group of people, I think, is a little bit less clear. Um, and I think in some cases it's pretty far from what those doing the science think of. So it's clearly not an approach or a specific method of instruction. It's not one element of reading being addressed. The science of reading, I think the pretty widely accepted definition would be just the accumulated body of evidence. We have a lot of evidence about how children learn how to read, what they need to know and be able to do in order to learn how to read, the things that teachers can do to support them. These are all things that have research behind them, and the that body of evidence, that research, is the science of reading. So when somebody says, is this program the science of reading, that just doesn't even make sense as a
Right.
question.
Yeah,
Is
I
that
know.
program based on that research? That's a good question to ask. Is that has that program been studied? That's a good question to ask. But there isn't some panel somewhere stamping their approval on a program or a method saying this is the science of reading, or this is approved by the science of reading or aligned with.
It would make our lives a lot easier, wouldn't it?
It sure would. It sure would.
I know. I was thinking every state is kind of doing a little something different, but that is a whole nother conversation in terms of that.
Oh, yes.
I'm wondering, Holly, if you might be able to help us differentiate between two terms that come up a lot when we're talking about the science of reading. I know that I hear research based and evidence based a whole lot, and I'm not sure that I understand the difference between the two. So if you could share what these terms mean and how they're different, that would be great.
Sure. So they are terms that get used interchangeably, and some people do mean the same thing when they use them. But and I don't know that there's a firm consensus that they have clear definitions, but most people who are engaged with research will discuss those two terms as something different. So research based, in my mind, means a program or a methodology or a strategy has um, been developed based on research about what we know about reading development and teaching and learning, and taking all of those things into account to create something based on that research. More often than not, the person or group of people developing something didn't actually do that research. They're interpreting the findings from that research and creating something based on their interpretation. So sometimes it aligns well with that research and sometimes not so much. But that's what I consider research based to mean. Evidence based, on the other hand, I consider to be what happens after a program or a methodology or a strategy has been developed. Has it been studied? Has it been put into actual use, and have the student outcomes or whatever it's attempting to accomplish, have those been evaluated? So research-based is what happens before a program is created, and evidence-based is what happens after. So that might be a nice, simple distinction.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
I was just going to say, it sounds like the research based is what could get a little tricky when we're looking at programs that say they're research based. Is, is it based on one study, and there might be some
Yeah,
questions about that study.
absolutely. I think both can actually get kind of tricky because, for the obvious reason, research based, if you're interpreting someone else's research, you may be interpreting it incorrectly. Your understanding of their findings may not be what they actually found. And so that's an obvious problem. But the evidence based part, I think, is also tricky because there's so many different levels of quality of evidence based on the type of research that's been conducted. And so just because something says it's evidence-based doesn't necessarily mean it has been studied rigorously or with the methods that we can draw strong conclusions from.
Yeah, I actually think this is what we wanted to ask you next, which was
okay.
maybe in your webinar, the Science of Reading or Snake Oil webinar that we watched and loved, you showed a pyramid graphic that had like the stronger and stronger evidence up the pyramid. Is that what you're kind of referring to here?
It's exactly what I mean. So there are a lot of different types of studies, and there's a lot of different types of evidence that isn't even based on a study. So most practitioners rely very heavily just on anecdotal evidence. I saw something work, so I know that it works. I saw it with my own eyes. But generally, you saw it with one child or one classroom or one school, and what you saw may not happen in other contexts with different children or classrooms or schools. And so what you saw may not have even actually been what you think you saw. So that's even a problem with anecdotal evidence. But you can go up that pyramid, and there are a lot of other levels of evidence that are actual studies conducted. But even when we're looking at studies don't always show what caused what. So you could have, for example, a case study where you're studying something on a very small basis, but you're not really testing something out in a case study. You're just examining a phenomenon to understand it better. You can have correlational studies that show two things are connected to each other. And I've seen instances where people use correlations to claim that one thing caused the other, but that's one of the most basic things about correlation is we can't establish causation from correlational studies. The classic example there is the correlation between ice cream sales and drownings. They're very highly correlated, but really no one in their right mind would say that ice cream sales cause drownings or that drownings cause ice cream sales. In that case, there's an obvious third variable, summer or hot weather. Both of those things are affected by hot weather. So ice cream sales go up, drownings go up. We're in the water more. So that's a classic example of why we can't say that correlation and causation are anywhere near the same. So then we get up to the point where we're actually conducting studies that can show that a particular program or method or strategy is causing a particular outcome. And usually the most common type of study there is a quasi-experimental study where we're comparing two or more groups of kids and we're looking at how they did. And that's most common because it's most feasible to conduct. You can look at a school or a classroom that's using a particular strategy and compare it with a school or a classroom that's not using that strategy and see who does better. A lot of programs have quasi-experimental evidence, and that's good. We can see that, yes, probably the differences are caused by that program, but we can't be sure. So the next level up the ladder, up that pyramid, is randomized control trials. So this is a much more challenging design, research design to pull off, because you have to have people agree to be a part of your study, but maybe not get your intervention. And not that many people want to be involved in a study where they know they're going to be getting the placebo, basically. So in a randomized control trial, the idea is that you have ideally individual children assigned to different treatments. But when that's not possible, classrooms, and when that's not possible, schools assigned to get different treatments, or get a treatment or not get a treatment and be the control group. And that is usually a very difficult thing to set up and a very expensive kind of study to conduct. So we see a lot fewer programs have that kind of research behind them, especially on a large scale. And generally, research done with more children is, we can draw stronger conclusions than research done with fewer children. So the larger, the better in general. So doing a large RCT, randomized control trial, is really difficult. So we don't see a lot of that. But that's really considered generally the gold standard for testing the effectiveness of a program. But we want to see at least quasi-experimental data.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And when I think about a randomized control trial, I wonder, why aren't there studies for all programs? But you did just name some barriers. I'm wondering if you have any others that you want to add to that, or if there's anything you want to say about that. To me, it does kind of feel like the biggest one is, I don't know that I'd sign off as a parent saying like, oh, maybe my kid won't get the thing that they need to learn to read. That feels challenging, or even as a principal in charge of a whole school. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is. And so getting a program study like that set up does require that. But if it's going to be rolled out slowly anyway, and not everybody's going to get the program anyway, that's one way that can happen. So we can say, well, we can't afford to provide it to everybody, and somebody's going to get it first anyway. We're just going to make it random, and that might even make it more fair. So that is one way that something like that can be rolled out. But mostly we want to make sure that programs have been studied, even that they've been field tested, to get input from teachers on, is this a program that is easy to use? That's important data as well, not just the student outcomes. If it's great student outcomes, but it's super hard to implement, then nobody's going to use it. So what's the value in that? But so there are other things beyond just student outcomes that we want to know about. And so few programs are even field tested to get teacher input along the way, and that's a real problem in the field.
Hi, can you tell us a little bit about UFLI Foundations, since you know it deeply, and what kinds of research you all did maybe before? And it's new, It's a newer program, so I'm sure that you still have more plans going forward.
Yeah, we honestly didn't set out to design a program, so I have to kind of preface this with this. I call UFLI kind of our UFLI Foundations is kind of an accident. We had been doing work for years in our pre-service teacher preparation programs, using different kinds of instructional models where we provided our teacher candidates with a lesson structure, and we wanted them to develop the background knowledge through our coursework so that they could plan effective lessons. And they did. They were extremely successful. And our program developed a really good reputation of preparing teachers very well to teach reading. So that got some attention, and we were able to get funding from James Patterson, the author, to continue this work that we had been doing with pre-service teachers and take it out into the field with practicing teachers who maybe didn't get that kind of teacher preparation. And so for a couple of years, we were doing this work, working with practicing teachers and giving them a lesson structure and asking them to then plan the lessons based on the knowledge about reading that we helped them develop during just really short summer academy kind of PD sessions. Some teachers took that and ran with it, were super successful. A lot more teachers attempted it and got frustrated and were not as successful. And then some teachers said, no, that's just too much work trying to plan it from scratch and didn't even try. So when we got a call from one of our partner schools saying, we really want to take a deep dive into phonics instruction and learn a lot more, can you help us do that? I don't know what came over me, but I said, well, why don't we just plan the lessons for you and then teach you what you need to know about why you're doing everything and teach you how to do it effectively, but not leave the lesson planning up to the teachers. And of course they said, that sounds great. Do that. Sure. So we got to work doing that, and we developed a scope and sequence that made sense to us, and we started developing lessons, and we were literally sending the school their lesson plans a week or two before they were implementing them, because we were really just doing it on the fly. And along the way, we were getting tons of input from them. We like this part of the lesson, but not this part. At first we were attempting to do one lesson in one 45-minute session. They said, no, this needs to be divided into two 30-minute sessions. So we took a lot of feedback from the teachers and refined the lesson. And one of the important elements of this is this was happening right after the COVID shutdowns. So the fall of 2020 is when they were in schools implementing this. So the kids started the year worse than they'd ever seen. But we were pretty pleased by the fact that they actually ended the year with higher than their pre-COVID scores. And so that really was encouraging. And we thought, well, maybe we're onto something with these lesson plans. And then our local district asked us to do a district-wide pilot. And so we decided to be a little bit more systematic in our data collection. And we looked at student outcomes across the year. And by mid-year, we were seeing in this district-wide pilot with 21 schools, really, really good results. And that's when we decided, well, maybe we should publish this and make it available to other teachers. So that's what we did. And by the end of the year, we had really, really strong effect sizes. This was a quasi-experimental design. It was not a randomized control trial. So there are limitations in what we can say about it from that. But we saw really good gains, and what we were able to do was to compare the kids who were getting UFLI. This was the 2021-22 school year. We were comparing them with the children from the year before. So one very valid criticism of that is those were the kids who were suffering from the immediate post-COVID effects. And that's true. However, around this area, for the most part, the second year after COVID, kids did worse than the first year after COVID, and the kids in our pilot district did substantially better. So they went against the grain of what was happening. So we feel really good about our data from that pilot study. But the 2 years of studying the program were really important to us. We would never have decided to put this out as a program for people to purchase if we weren't sure that it had a really good likelihood of being successful wherever it was implemented.
Okay, so I heard you say a couple key terms there. For teachers listening, I'm just going to do a recap, Holly, and you can affirm or say, Lori, you missed something. I heard you say that you did field testing and received feedback from teachers. So you are ensuring that this is taught in classrooms and you're receiving feedback so that you can make adjustments. I also heard you say that word systematic, scope and sequence, and that maybe you didn't say systematic, but you said scope and sequence, and I'm just putting words in your mouth. I don't mean to. So you definitely said we developed a scope and sequence. So I know that there's a structure to how we're teaching this. Yes. I also heard you say it was a quasi-experimental study, which I put a star next to in my notes because that's a good thing. But we know even better is a randomized control trial. I heard you say that you hadn't done that. maybe yet. Are you planning to maybe do something of the sort?
Yes, we are hoping to. We have a couple of different sites that we are hoping will work out for a randomized control trial, but we have not established that for sure. But that is certainly in the cards that we do plan to do that at some point. We're hoping this coming year it will work out, but so far that is not confirmed. Um, but yeah, so the field testing was critically important to us. We Field testing gives us a sense of feasibility. Is this a feasible program to implement? Is it too much work, too many things to do, or do they have the right materials? Is it usable? Is it teacher friendly? Is it student friendly? These are the kinds of things that we can get through field testing, and how can we make it easier to implement? And that's one of the things that we've gotten an enormous amount of feedback on. Teachers tell us all the time that they find it really teacher friendly. I think the fact that everyone on the development team is a teacher, either currently in the classroom or has a lot of experience in the classroom, is really critical. We understand what it takes to teach and what kinds of things make it easier to do. So that was a really important part. But yes, and then doing a quasi-experimental study gave us enough evidence to feel confident that what we have is effective. Like I said, there are limitations to the study. We fully acknowledge that. But I also feel like it's actually a lot more evidence than a lot of other programs that are out there. So we feel good about it.
Yeah. I'm wondering too if you could walk us through maybe an example of like what might be confusing in research or reports from publishers. Because I remember when we were in Baltimore, when we were asking publishers to supply research on programs, and it's like everybody comes in with their flyers and their words, they're saying this study and that study. And I just remember feeling really overwhelmed. And
Yeah.
I'm sure that some publishers supplied better stuff, research and materials than others, but it was very confusing. It felt very misleading. It was almost like who gave a better presentation versus how we got to the meat of the stuff. And I know that that's like a real I don't want to say problem, because it's like exciting to be looking for curriculum, but it's a problem in the way I think that we approach it. So I'm wondering if you can like kind of do two things. One, say more about what to look for and what could be misleading, but then also share examples of what could be confusing or misleading in reports. And I know we mentioned a couple specifics in the pre-call.
Yeah, there's lots out there that can be confusing. I think what to look for is, um, if you have really strong state standards, you want to make sure that what you have aligns with those standards. That's kind of an obvious one. There's also some good tools out there. I think one of the better ones is the Reading League has a tool for evaluating curriculum and determining if key features are present or in some cases absent. We want to make sure that they don't have certain features. So those elements I think are really worth paying attention to. Then the confusing part really is about what I was just describing, this strength of evidence piece, because one of the things that the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, has an expectation of programs that are using federal funding in particular, but a lot of states have just made it for state funding as well, that they need to meet, need to have evidence that meets ESSA criteria. So there's a lot of confusion around that. ESSA criteria are based on the kinds of study designs that I just described. And so you'll see, it's unfortunate that they use tiers as their term, because in reading we have tiers of words and tiers in MTSS programs. I mean, there's so many uses of that term that gets more confusing. But they use the term tiers to talk about different levels of evidence. So a tier 1 level of evidence for ESSA is a randomized control trial, because it has the the most quality of evidence or the strength of evidence. And then tier 2 is a quasi-experimental design, and it goes much deeper into, how many children need to be involved in the studies and that kind of thing. But it's much more specific than this. But then there's, tier 3 where something is promising. So, and they also use other terms. So strong evidence, moderate evidence, promising evidence. So these are important things to understand because the quality of the evidence is not the same as the quality of the program. And so there are programs out there that have that are very strong programs, but they, to date anyway, don't have very strong evidence. And there are programs that have very strong evidence, but are not strong programs. So one of my favorite instances of this is, I thought was almost comical. I got a promotional email about LLI. And in this email, it was flashing almost, look, evidence for ESSA has rated LLI strong, and had, it was like, this is what they were emphasizing. But really what evidence for ESSA had done, this is a website that, looks at those levels of evidence and publishes it. There was strong evidence, but it was strong. That means that the studies that looked at this program were strong, but it also then had an effect size. The average effect size of these studies was, I believe, a 0.13, I think, which is a very, very weak effect size. The way that John Hattie describes effect sizes in all of the meta-analysis work that he does, he would consider that developmental effects. That's like less than having any instruction at all. It's what you would see just as kids grow over the course of time.
Oh,
so
wow.
They're sending
Oh
a
my
promotional
gosh.
email, right? They're sending a promotional email that says there's very strong evidence that our program doesn't really work. And it really concerned me because either the people developing or selling the program don't understand this evidence, or they understand it and they hope you won't when you get the email. And either one is not a good look. And so that, to me, is a big problem, because I do think that most people who received that promotional email thought, wow, there's strong evidence for this program.
Yeah, it sounds
There's strong
good.
evidence for the studies of this program, but the program itself doesn't work effectively. So I think that that's a big issue with looking at evidence.
Holly, is What Works Clearinghouse similar to Evidence for ESSA in that way?
Yeah, they're more concerned also about the quality of the studies, which I think is an important issue to understand. And that is, I think overall, this kind of lack of understanding in the field of what constitutes rigorous research. It is really important, and it's a big problem. And I think over the course of all of these different ways of looking at evidence, there are all of these different programs. Let me re-say that because that was really bad. Yes, I think that there is a real issue with these different entities that review programs. What Works Clearinghouse is certainly one of those. There's nothing wrong with what they're doing. They're doing a great job of making sure that the evidence is rigorous. The problem lies in then the translation of that to practitioners, because they are not clear, and I don't think that Evidence for ESSA is clear enough that what you're looking at is a rating of the quality of the study. You have to actually understand the results of the study to understand, well, now that I know it was a good study, what did the study find? So What Works Clearinghouse does a little bit better job of that part of it, of letting you know how effective the actual program was. But one of the criticisms of What Works Clearinghouse is that they'll look at the quality of the studies, but not always who conducted the studies. So I was mentioning our quasi-experimental design. We conducted the study in that we implemented the program in the district, and we got the data from the district, but we had an independent external evaluator analyze the results so that we knew for sure what we were doing wasn't, a result of our bias. We didn't pay that evaluator to do that. They were doing that to look at the evidence of that. And so a lot of the studies of some programs were paid for by the publishers of the program. And that's not to say that whoever conducted it was biased, but it raises that question and it leaves that open. If it's not a completely independent evaluation, which ours was not either, then I think that you have to take that with a grain of salt as well.
Yeah. I keep thinking about the evidence for ESSA and What Works Clearinghouse, because I know when I worked in the district at Baltimore City, when we wrote grants for, we would get a lot of grants to adopt programs, and that's where we would look. And I don't know, I'm be perfectly frank, I don't know that I knew that I was looking at it the wrong way. Like you just said, we saw green and said, okay, this has strong evidence. Let's go for it.
Yeah. And the effect size piece is an important one. And,
huge.
Different people will give you different ideas of what is a desirable effect size. But generally you want to have an effect size that's moderate or large or very large. And so you want to see effect sizes of at least a 0.3. That would be the range that would be considered moderate. 0.4 would be better, and then the higher you go, the better. So most effect sizes are up to 1, but they can be higher than that. They can be much higher than that. So if you see something with an effect size of a 0.6 or a 0.9, you're in really good shape. 0.1, 0.13, not so good.
That's really helpful to know. I'm taking all of these notes and writing them down like a little cheat sheet for myself. I bet our listeners are too. They're awesome. But like this makes me think so much of what we talked about in our pre-call in terms of really asking questions about what we see and just not like believing everything. And one of the things that you had mentioned, and I think Melissa and I were like, didn't realize that this was something that we should have dug deeper into at the time was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Holly, but it was that number of repetitions. And it was like 1 to 4. I can't remember. Right. 4 to is it 4 to 20, 20 to 100, 100 to 2. I'm guessing that those are the ranges. Do you want to elaborate since you know what I'm talking about? And
yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. So this was something, just an exchange that I saw on Twitter that I wondered about, and I asked about because I had seen these numbers repeated. So the idea was, how many exposures to a word does a child need in order to commit it to memory, or to orthographically map it, or however it was phrased. And it was something like 1 to 4 for a gifted child, 4 to 14 for a typical child, or what. And it had all these very neat numbers, and 14 to 40 and 41 to, I was like, how did they get those numbers? Because that seems such an odd thing. I can't imagine as a researcher ever generating such pretty numbers like that. And so I was curious, and then I saw this discussion about it, and somebody had included it in a presentation. And so I inquired, and the person who had presented it said, here's where it was from. And they posted a picture from a book where it had been cited. And they had cited it exactly, the presenter had cited it exactly as it was cited in the book. But the book referenced a study for where they got that information. So, I have access as a university faculty member to journals, and I went and looked that up. I looked at that journal article that was cited. It didn't have anything remotely like those numbers in it. And it did say that, some general statement like children who have more exposures are more likely to remember words than those who have fewer exposures. I'm like, okay, that makes sense. But where did these numbers come from? Clearly not from that article. but this book had cited it, and that book was reputable authors. It wasn't, so it was a concern to me. And I see that all the time, that books are often cited as research, and books are not research. Books are just somebody wrote something down and they got it published in a book, and that's great for them, but it doesn't mean that it is research. So I'll see claims of, the science of reading supports this. I'm like, what does it really? Can you tell me where you find this research? And it's almost always somebody's book. I'm like, no, books are not research. And so, blog posts are not research. We need to, even all journal articles are not research. There are lots of journal articles that are just really either reviews of research or thought pieces. This is what I think as an expert. Here, let me explain it to you. Those are great articles, but that's not research. And so I think that just because something has been written down and published somewhere doesn't mean it's research, and we really need to be careful about that.
That's so helpful. One of our guests actually shared those numbers.
And a while back.
Probably over a year ago. And we saw the audience, like we saw people creating their own graphics of those numbers, and we were like, oh wow. And same thing, we were like, yeah, it came from this book, like, and like you said, reputable authors of this book. We didn't take that next step you did, which we were glad to learn from you.
Well, and maybe the numbers are accurate and there is a good reference for them, but the reference that was cited in that book did not have those numbers in it.
So helpful.
Yeah.
It also is helpful to
question.
To know what the red flag is, like that went off in your head. I love that.
That it was like those numbers are too neat and clean. You never. I mean, if it had said, the on average, 1 to 3.4 exposures, and some ugly numbers or weird numbers like that, I might have never checked. But because it was so neat and clean, it's like, it doesn't work like that. It never.
And interestingly, probably why people latch onto it, because it has neat and clean numbers.
It's easier to remember that way, too,
right?
But that's just one of many, many, many examples of things that I've seen people cite as, this is obviously this is true. It's research. Like, no, that's not research.
Yeah. Well, speaking of neat and clean, I feel like that's why in the science of reading movement, or as we talk about the science of reading research in the movement, we keep using these terms explicit and systematic. And I'm hoping that you can define these terms for us, because I think there's a difference, and I'm hoping that you can get that difference out there. But I think that's why sometimes we latch on to teaching, in the foundational skills in the K2, because it is a neat and clean. You can see when kids master those skills versus comprehension is a little way messier. So, all right, Holly, I'm turning it over to you. Explicit, systematic. What does this define it for us?
Well, I'm going to start with systematic because that's a little bit simpler of a concept. And you touched on it earlier when you said a scope and sequence. That's kind of the heart and soul of systematic. So systematic is mostly just you're thinking about things in a logical order. You're designing something that takes into account how people learn, and so that means building on prior knowledge and so forth. So the analogy I always use for systematic is an architect's blueprint, right? So a builder would never just show up on a vacant lot with a bunch of boards and start nailing them together, right? There's a plan, and there's a system of what needs to happen first and then next and the next. There's some leeway. You can put in this window before that door, who cares? But you got to have a foundation before you have walls, and you got to have walls before you have a roof. These are very clear delineations, and reading works like that too. It doesn't matter if you teach, vowel teams before R-controlled vowels, but you need to know the letters of the alphabet before you get to, more advanced grapheme phoneme correspondences. So there's some kind of basic things that matter. And we don't have a perfect scope and sequence that has been proven. This is the one, but there are things that we need to consider. So the systematic part is really thinking about the logic behind how you organize things. The explicit part it's harder to pinpoint, because I hear a lot of people calling their programs explicit when that's not what I would describe as explicit. And so explicit is very clear and direct and unambiguous. I think that's one of the terms that I really associate most with explicit. It's unambiguous. It is this, it's not that. And so helping a child understand a concept involves knowing what it is and what it's not. So understanding the boundaries of the concept is part of explicit instruction. But really what we're talking about is just making something very clear. So if I'm teaching a phonics concept, something like the grapheme phoneme correspondence between, the letter M and the sound M, right? If I want kids to know that, I need them to know that this is the shape of the letter. This is the name of the letter. This is the sound associated with the letter. This is the placement in a word, the grapheme placement. Can it come at the beginning of a word? And when we're talking about words at this stage, we're talking about one syllable words. So can it come at the beginning? Can it come in the middle? Can it come at the end? Where can it appear? Yes, it can come in the beginning and the end, but you're not going to see an M in the middle of a one syllable word. So learning those kinds of things is part of it. And now how to apply that, how to blend words to be able to decode, how to segment words to be able to encode or spell them. These are all parts of it as well. So explicit really helps is what's necessary to understand what is this concept and what it's not. So an M has all these features. It looks a little bit like an N, but it's not an N. And here are the differences. And so, at the end of an explicit lesson, kids should know all this and have a pretty good understanding and be able to apply what they've learned.
Holly, what happens in programs where it's more ambiguous? Like, what do you see? It seems like, of course, that's what we should do.
Right? Well, I think most programs really don't encompass all of those features. And those aren't even all the features. Like when I'm teaching, an M, I'm going to talk about the articulatory gesture for that sound. And when you're producing this phoneme, your lips are together, your voice is on, your vocal cords are vibrating, those kind of things. So really getting down to the nitty-gritty to help kids understand the concept. And I don't think that happens much at all. It's like, here's an M says, let's read some words, right? I mean, it's much more just kind of haphazard. There's also, I see in a lot of programs, a lot of independent work. I don't think phonics can be effectively taught with worksheets and workbooks. I don't, not to say that they're all bad, but I don't think it's a good use of kids' time or effort. So I feel like if you're going to teach them skills, it needs to be interactive. There needs to be sounds being made out loud and it's not quiet seat work. So those are some of the kinds of things. You can't, having a whole worksheet where, okay, color in the pictures of things that start with M. Yeah, how much?
I remember this from first grade. I think I did.
Oh, I did it too. I absolutely did that. In fact, I probably did that as a teacher because those were the materials that were available to me at the time. And I think, we can't fault teachers for using what they're provided, but we need to be looking critically. And what are kids really learning from drawing a line from this letter to this picture or whatever it is? If they're not actively reading words and spelling words and applying what they're learning, that really doesn't matter. Probably what we talk about the most in terms of explicit instruction being effective is really ample opportunities to respond, having kids practice as much as we can get in a lesson, and then having that practice interleaved across lessons. So after we have introduced and practiced a lesson and we move on to a concept, we move on to a new concept, we're practicing the old concept still, we introduce a new concept, we're still practicing all of those old concepts, and we keep seeing the same things come up lesson after lesson after lesson to really make sure that kids have lots and lots of opportunities to respond. And we're monitoring those responses to make sure that they're correct, that they're not practicing something the wrong way. If kids are doing independent seat work, you're not able to monitor them in real time, and they could be making inaccurate connections, and you're not there to stop that from happening and to redirect them. So
Yeah, I keep thinking about what we talked about earlier. Like, it does feel a little messier, this interleaving concept, where I know it's shown to prove long-term retention with, with lots of practice. But like you gave this example from UFLI with short I, that over 10 lessons in UFLI, short I is practiced 338 times
right.
with the concept of interleave. And to me, that just makes a lot of sense that over the time after that, within explicit, and with explicit teaching, with a systematic scope and sequence, that, I mean, that as a teacher, that makes me feel really confident that 338 times over 10 lessons, my students are going to
And it
have
doesn't,
practice with
right.
short I.
It doesn't stop after 10 lessons. They're still going to see it after that,
Yeah.
but just to get it firm real early on. And that's another part of systematic that I really didn't touch on, is just this idea that what you're getting kids to practice is applying what they have learned so far. And so one of the things that we spent an enormous amount of time on is creating word lists for practice that only included the grapheme phoneme correspondences that kids have been exposed to so far. So it's not just any random list of words with sh in them. It's words that have sh and the other things that they've learned so far. So if they haven't gotten to th, it doesn't have an sh and a th, right? So those kinds of things are not necessarily part of every program, but that's a part of being systematic as well, that we're only expecting kids to be able to do the things that we have taught them, we don't expect them to catch on to other things, although most kids do catch on to other things and can figure out words with features they haven't been taught. That's not an expectation in a systematic program.
Makes so much sense.
Yeah, that concept of interleave practice is so contrary to what we do in classrooms so much that, like, the traditional spelling test is my favorite example, because we talk about teaching spelling. We're not usually teaching spelling. We give kids a list of words and say, here, go teach yourself these words. You've got a week. And to do that, I want you to write them 5 times each, and I want you to put them in alphabetical order, and I want you to write sentences with them and all these other activities. And they practice, and they come in and take the test and they get 100%. Yay, they've learned them. But have they really?
Mm-hmm.
No, we know deep down they haven't really learned them, because a week or 2 or 3 later, they don't use the correct spellings of those words when they write them. So they really didn't learn them. And so that's just a classic example of blocked practice paired with interleave practice, where over, like you just said, 10 lessons, which is over, 5 weeks of instruction, you're seeing that correspondence with the short I 338 times. That at the end of those 5 weeks, those kids know what sound that letter I represents. There's no doubt in their minds anymore. So that, and they're going to remember it. That's the idea behind interleave practice, is it leads to longer term retention of skills. So kids don't retain when they have that block practice. They get 100% on Friday, but 2 weeks later, if you gave them the same test, they'd get a 40 or 50%. So
that's so helpful. And you really have me thinking at the moment, because I always bring up, when you're teaching comprehension. I taught middle school, so I always think about my practice of teaching. We would teach inferences, and then I would similarly give a quiz of some kind and be like, yes, they know how to make inferences from this text. Right. And it was always weird to me, because I was like, yeah, but I want them to do that in other texts. Like, it's not like, I don't want them to be like, check off the box, they can do it, now we're done with that, move on. But I do often think of foundational skills and think, you can kind of check off a box and move on. But I love thinking about it this way of like, you still don't want to, even if they can, right? Even if they, you see that they can identify that sound, or they can write the letter correctly, whatever it is, you still want to keep it going.
Yeah. And I think with foundational skills, a lot of programs do a decent job at developing kids' accuracy with these skills, but not that many do a good job at promoting automaticity.
Oh, I
And
love that.
automaticity is really our goal. We want kids to know something so well that it's effortless for them. That's how I define automaticity, by the way. It's just effortlessness. That I've done something so many times, I don't have to think about it. It's like when I drive a car. I don't have to think anymore how to turn on the blinker or how to step on the brake. That stuff just happens automatically without any conscious attention to it. I can be on the phone. I can be jam into my favorite song on the radio and not even paying that close of attention, and I can still drive safely because it's all so automatic. I want kids to be able to be like that with their reading, so that instead of devoting attention to labor, slog through a word that they, a new word to decode, they can just look at it and figure it out quickly because they know how to do those things so automatically. That means all of their cognitive load, their working memory, can be devoted to understanding the text, and they can really think about the author's message rather than how to get through this word. So that piece of it is the other part of practice that's so essential, is we're developing automaticity. We want to get kids past this, and if we do a really good job at that in kindergarten, first and second grade, then really we won't have to think about it. Beyond that, most kids, when we get into more challenging grapheme phoneme correspondences, or multisyllabic words or morphemes, most kids won't still need that degree of explicit and systematic instruction. They get to a point where they can start teaching themselves, and they come across a new grapheme that they've never seen before, they can use other ways to figure it out. When we expect kids to do that from the beginning, most kids fail. They can't do that. They never reach proficiency. We need to make sure that we get them to that point that they're able to start teaching themselves.
Love it. Like, it feels like a mic drop moment. I don't know. Well, in all seriousness, I know we're running out of time here with you, Holly. We could probably keep going for a really long time. But is there anything else you want to share about research and evidence, or programs that say they're based in the science of reading?
Yeah, I feel like, you mentioned the, science or snake oil webinar. That really got me thinking so hard about it. I had always heard this term snake oil salesman, but I never really knew the story behind it.
I
And I
love the
went
story.
and read it up, read up on it, and found, yeah, there were actually people who sold snake oil and claimed that it solved all your problems. And there actually was snake oil that had healing effects, but the stuff that these people were selling was not that snake oil, and it had no effects. And eventually, what they were selling didn't even actually have snake oil in it.
Oh,
they were just putting that on there, and so there wasn't any regulation of it. And then the United States government had an agency called the Bureau of Chemistry at the time that analyzed this one guy's snake oil and found it was not effective. It didn't have anything useful, and they made him stop. And that agency then became the Food and Drug Administration, where now anything that's sold, either things you're going to eat or medicine that you're going to take, has to get tested to a point that we know that it's safe. We know that it does what it's supposed to do. We don't have anything like that in education. We have different entities like What Works Clearinghouse that do look at the research that's done, but there's no expectation that everybody's programs get tested to that degree and to have that level of rigor of study. There's no expectation. But to me, it would be just wonderful to have an entity that required programs to be effective. If you're going to use taxpayer dollars to purchase it, it's got to have, of whatever level, it's got to have, this level of approval, not of, philosophy behind it, but of its effect on kids' learning. And we don't have anything like that. So that means practitioners are left having to figure it out for themselves, and it's a big ask. So anyway,
It really is.
I don't know if that's a it's not an optimistic point to leave us on, but I do think it means that teachers really do have the responsibility to learn, and school and district leaders have the responsibility to learn and understand what evidence really is.
Yeah. I think Holly Lane for Secretary of Education one day.
I know.
That's what I'm taking away.
Oh, no, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you.
I know. I kind of want to do an FDA for education now with you at the helm. We're here for it.
Not with me at the helm. There are plenty of people who are far more capable of that than I am, and maybe actually might even want to do it. But I do.
Yeah. Well, we're putting the idea out there.
Right. I do think we need something like that, because we've seen the detrimental effects of not having that, and having things just become popular for whatever reason.
Right.
That is not based on evidence, not based on science. Yeah. So we want to make sure that what we're doing has evidence of effectiveness.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Especially when it affects children's lives and people's lives every day. So
yes. Absolutely.
Well, we are so grateful that you talked with us today. I know that I feel much more confident. I wish that I had talked with you 10 years ago and had all these notes. It makes it really just feel really easy to understand. So thank you for making it easy to understand for everyone, from teachers to district leaders to school leaders to maybe parents even listening who are wanting to know about what's happening in their school district with their taxpayer dollars. You never know.
Right. Exactly. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.